Well, hello, Centrepoint Church, and welcome back to Centrepoint at home. Here we are again in your living room, on your phone, wherever you are, hopefully at home this weekend, due to the recent restrictions imposed by our state government due to the COVID outbreak. But it's okay, and it's an absolute privilege to be with you today. Pastor Russell and Nikki are in Perth, Western Australia, so you've got my face today for a brief moment. And in a moment, we're going to hear from Dan Paterson for a short message that'll go for about 18 minutes. Dan Paterson is the founder of Questioning Christianity and is a Christian apologist, and he's got a great taster to give us today, as he'll be back with us on January 31. And so I'm looking forward to hearing that today, and I believe it's going to be a blessing to all of your lives. So why don't you find a comfortable spot and feel free to engage in the comments in the YouTube chat to the side here as well, and enjoy a brief message from Dan Paterson, and I'll talk to you soon.
Well, hello, Centrepoint Church. My name is Dan Paterson, and this isn't exactly how I hoped that we would meet for the first time. We're back in lockdowns here in Brisbane, and so we're tuning in digitally via live stream for today's service. I hope to be with you in the flesh in a few weeks' time, COVID permitting and God willing. But I hope in the meantime, you get to be hunkered down with friends or family members for something of an unexpected pause, a rest, given that it seems what happened in 2020 isn't going to stay in 2020. Maybe we need a little bit more downtime. But what I want to do today is help introduce you to asking hard questions of the Bible. I'm the founder of a brand new ministry called Questioning Christianity, which is really about helping to connect the Christian story to these sorts of big questions of life. And perhaps the biggest question I've been asked over the last 12 months is, where is God in all of this mess? The fires and the floods, the pandemics and the protests, the election anxieties, and all of the economic uncertainty. Where do we find God in this scene? And if you're new to the Christian story, these kinds of hard questions, they're welcome. God is not afraid of your questions, and Jesus had doubters as some of his closest friends. Why? Because truth invites questioning. And what I want to do today in looking at this question of where is God in all of the mess is to explore it through the lens of a biblical story, a story from the New Testament in the Gospel of Mark. So if you've got a Bible at home, you're following along, jump to Mark chapter 4. We're going to read from verses 35 through to 41. And here we go. That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is God's word. A few years ago, I was in Israel with my wife, Erin, and we had the opportunity to actually go on the Sea of Galilee in a boat. The day looked fine, it was sunny, but as we're out there on the water, all of a sudden a big wind did pick up, and we found these waves bashing against the side of the boat, and I was nervous. Nonetheless, the story that's being described here was way more intense. And it's a scene brilliantly depicted in Rembrandt's painting, The Storm of the Sea of Galilee, which is famous for having been stolen in one of the greatest art heists of modern history. But as you zoom in on the details, if you Google this portrait, you'll see the fear in the faces of the disciples, this terrible uncertainty, this moment of crisis. And they find themselves asking, where is God? What's going on? Why is this happening? And what I want to suggest to you today through the lens of this story is that in surprising ways, far from being absent, God is powerfully present in this scene. And the first way I want to suggest that God is present in this scene and in our messy world right now is the way that God is present in our collective protest. One of the things I've tried to do over the last 12 months or so is to be careful to listen to those who are most affected by what's been happening. the anger, the grief, the frustration, the anxiety. And you could sum up their response really in a single sentence, that this is not the way that things should be. Something has gone wrong. And it's an innate reaction we all have whenever we look upon evil and suffering in the world. This is not the way that things should be. Something has gone wrong. But what best explains this deep intuition, this internal form of protest against the way that things are? Because if I was a purely secular person, if I didn't have any room for God in my story, then I'm not sure I would have much of a register to be able to explain this intuition, at least not to ground it in anything real. Because if the secular story is true, if this universe is all that there ever was, is, and ever shall be, then ultimately this is the way that things have always been. Nature is read in tooth and claw. Our history is written in successive generations of suffering. We cannot escape. It's built in, hardwired to the system, and it's never been any different. And so one of the things that plagued C.S. Lewis when he was an atheist was this thought: why is it then that we, creatures who have grown up, evolved in this kind of a milieu, in this stream, why have we come to feel like there's something wrong with it, that this is not the way that things should be? It just doesn't fit. And yet it fits very neatly into the Christian story. Because in the Christian story, were you to go back to the first pages of the Bible, the book doesn't start with a world gone wrong. It starts with a world made right. That in the beginning, God created everything for good. And he made humanity, gave us his image to love God, to love each other, and to care for this planet. We were created. Our innate purpose is deep and meaningful relationships and a role to contribute to the common good and the human project. But what happened in the story to corrupt our harmony with nature, with each other, and with God was the introduction of what the Bible describes as evil or sin, where human beings abuse the freedom that God gave us, the same freedom that makes it possible for us to love and to do good. Instead, we abuse that to break God's moral law, to go against the moral design of God's universe and crash into that reality whereby we and the whole system over which we were set to govern, this world, became broken, that things are not now as they were intended to be. You see, even in the original creation, viruses had their place in the delicate ecosystem of our planet. We're told by top flight virologists that were it not for viruses, then single-celled bacteria would completely consume all of Earth's available resources. Higher life forms like us just could not exist. And yet it's only when these viruses now jump over into the human and the animal population that they do things that God never intended. Because as soon as we did evil and were exiled from God's presence, we became susceptible to suffering, to sickness, to death, to disease, to decay, to disorder in a way that was never intended for us. So that rather than love God, we turned our back on him. Rather than love our neighbor, instead we curved inwards on ourselves and instead hated our neighbor. We became tribal and partisan, us and them. And rather than relate rightly to nature, all of a sudden there was a break in that relationship and we were at the mercy of the waves, the same way the disciples find themselves. This does not feel like the way that things should be, at the mercy of the waves. And all of this reality in the Bible breaks God's heart. Twice in the New Testament, we're told that Jesus weeps. Once over a graveside of a dead friend, Lazarus, and another time over a divided Jerusalem, a city torn apart by unbelief and by division and hatred. You see, if the Christian story is true, and I think our deepest intuitions point towards this, well, then God cares more intensely for the pain and the suffering and the injustice of this world than we ever could. Jesus mourns over the death toll that we've seen mounting in our country and in others right around the world. And he is angered by the knee of injustice as it holds down those who are oppressed. You see, God is present in our collective protest whenever we mark that this is not how things should be. In a surprising way, that actually points upwards towards God in the world. A second way I think we see God at work in this scene is that God is present in our animating hope. That this is not how things will be. You see, if the Christian story is true and Jesus really did rise from the dead, then the kind of power we see him having here over nature to calm the wind and the waves, that was just the beginning. Jesus has the power over death itself to reverse what seems permanent. In fact, if the resurrection of Jesus is true, then death is no longer a full stop in the sentence of reality. Instead, now it's merely a comma, a pause. Because what is promised upon his return is that all will be resurrected to face judgment. And that those who have trusted in Jesus, that resurrection will be unto eternal life, a life that cannot ever perish, spoil, or fade. That is the Christian hope. And it changes how we face down danger here so that we don't ultimately have to be afraid, even if the waves come to take us. You see, I had to watch in this last 12 months as my dear neighbor succumbed to a creeping death. And it wasn't from COVID-19, it was from cancer. And she fought hard against a terminal diagnosis because she, deep down, she confessed to me, was terrified of death. She wasn't a Christian. She didn't believe in God. And facing down death, it felt awfully permanent. And death seemed to rob her life of any meaning. Because if in 100 years no one knew that she exists, no one remembers her, her children have passed on and have died, well then what's the point? If it all comes to nothing, then life is ultimately meaningless. Because if all of your hopes are in something in this life, something you can cling onto, but they could be stolen away from you, then a moment of crisis, a storm like what the disciples were enduring, they should be afraid because they can really drown. And that drowning would be ultimate. But if Jesus is who he claims to be, if he did really rise from the dead, then that changes everything. And I have watched the way in which this animating hope changes the way that people that I love have faced down death. Whether it be a family member, or a great-grandfather, who on his deathbed, dying of cancer, Jack was animated by this hope that ultimately death isn't going to win. That when he closes his eyes, he will open them again in the presence of Jesus. He was welcoming death. I saw it in my friend Nabil Qureshi. He was facing down death. Online, he did an entire video series at my age with stage 4 stomach cancer. He wasn't afraid of dying. He wasn't afraid of death. He was excited to go and meet the Lord. You see, if you believe in Jesus, then death does not win. And this animating hope, it shifts how you live here and now. You don't have to cling to the things of this earth. You can enjoy them, but they're not your deepest meaning makers. Because death cannot steal away from you what is ultimate. And so I think God is present, surprisingly, in the animating hope that many of us have, that this is not how things will be. But somewhere between our collective protest, that this is not how things were in the past, how they should be right now, and this is not in the animating hope of the future, how things will be, we actually find the resources to live life different in the present, to face down our crises, our storms, the chaos, with a purposeful posture. Because if the Christian story, again, isn't true, if I was a pure secular person just chasing down a hedonistic lifestyle, trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, well then the chaos of 2020 and now rolling into 2021, well that just, it seems to be an interruption. It seems to be a distraction. It seems to undermine the meaning of my life if my life is about pursuing happiness. But what if life's purpose is about something deeper than just circumstantial happiness? What if it's about becoming a substantial kind of person? Because if the Christian story is true, which I think you can make a great argument for, whether it's like history or philosophy, through science or human experience, well, then ultimately our purpose here is to become more like Jesus. Holiness, not happiness, is the ultimate goal. And the irony is that becoming holy, we enjoy God's presence so that we become the happiest kind of people. Now, one of the things I've discovered in my own experience of suffering in the past, 24 years ago, we had a terrible car accident that left my mum badly brain damaged. I think back now with that gift of retrospect, and I'm not sure, as much as I probably would have at different points in the story, I'm not sure I would want to erase that experience from our past. Why? Because the gift of retrospect allows us to see so many ways in which who we are now is shaped by the difficult experiences that we go through. The New Testament talks about suffering being like a fire that tests who we are, but also like a forge that makes who we are. And think about all the best stories that we love, those epics, Lord of the Rings or the Narnia Chronicles or Star Wars sagas. All of these, the characters don't start out as heroes. Heroes aren't born, they're made. And it's through the process of going through suffering, of struggle, of hardship, of failure, of all of this disappointment that people end up being forged, their character encouraged through those flames. And the Christian story says exactly this much, that God is big enough and He's good enough to take whatever happens to us. And if we lean into Him, trust Him to actually turn that around so that our suffering, unlike the secular story, it's not meaningless, but it actually serves a particular purpose. God is big enough to weave it into His plan, even though He may not cause it or stand behind it, yet He allows it because it can serve a meaningful purpose in His plan. When it boils down to it, I would much rather want my suffering to mean something than not mean something, to be used to form and shape me into a substantial person rather than just feel like it's a distraction or it's a detour from life's ultimate purpose. And so in this way, I think we find that God is profoundly present in the meaning that we find in these moments if we lean in to trust God. Romans 8:28, for those who love God and are called according to His purpose, He works together all things for good. And so, collective protest. This is not how things should be. The idea of animating hope. This is not how things will be. And here with the disciples, not being saved out of the storm, but going through the storm to learn what they needed to about who Jesus really is, well, this is the idea of the meaning that we find in these moments, that through it, God can make us who we are meant to be. Ultimately, though, in this story, the most surprising place we find God is right in the boat with the disciples. He's not absent, He's there with them. And for those of you who are new to the Christian story, this is the heart of what Christians believe, that in Jesus, God became human, Emmanuel, Christmas time, to come and be with us, not to leave us, not to remain distant in heaven's joys, but to draw near to earth's struggle and woes, to love us through the pain and ultimately to experience it alongside of us. And so I want you to know, far from being absent, God is profoundly present in the midst of this chaos. In fact, even more, if it is true in the Christian story, in Genesis 1 and 2, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless without void, darkness over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over these waters. Waters are an ancient symbol of chaos, and God's presence hovering over the waters. Man, chaos is not where God is absent. Chaos is always where God has gone to do His best work. And so this year, as we look forward, I am hopeful that in the midst of whatever comes, whatever struggles, temptations, disappointments, whatever hardships follow, that if we lean into God, if we listen to His protest, voice it through us, if we allow Him to be able to use suffering and struggle to make us, well then this can be one of the best years yet in helping us fulfill our purpose and become more like the people we are meant to be. I hope this has been an encouragement to you. I look forward to being with you in person. God bless you.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, and what a great introduction to what we have to look forward to on January 31, COVID permitting. And thank you so much for investing into our church, and I hope you've enjoyed that today, whatever time that you're watching this. We will get some information to you as soon as we can regarding what will happen next weekend and the results of the COVID testing this weekend. So keep an eye on your emails and your SMS and social media, and we'll clarify everything and that you need to know very soon. Please keep in mind our vision offering that we have for the cafe this year. If you're still considering that, you can still continue to give and give your regular offerings online through the website, through the app, through your online banking. We encourage you to do that. So have a great week, and we're believing that we'll be here next week in our church being able to meet with each other, and praying for you. See you soon.